Diane Walker stood frozen in her kitchen, coffee mug suspended midway to her lips as she stared out the window. There in her backyard pool, her private, fence-enclosed pool, floated Margaret Hollingsworth, the Oak Ridge Estates HOA president, alongside three women Diane recognized from the neighborhood board. They lounged on brightly colored floats, sipping mimosas, completely oblivious to Diane's stunned presence at the window. What the actual hell? Diane whispered to herself, feeling the heat rise in her chest. She just returned from a 2-day business trip, exhausted and looking forward to a quiet Saturday morning. Instead, she found uninvited guests treating her pool like a country club amenity. She checked her phone. No messages from Margaret requesting access. No emails from the HOA about pool inspections. Nothing but a missed call from an unknown number that had come in last night when her phone was on silent. Diane slammed her mug down, coffee splashing onto the granite countertop. This wasn't the first time Margaret had overstepped her boundaries, not by a long shot, but it was certainly the most egregious. As HOA president, Margaret Hollingsworth wielded her authority like a medieval scepter, demanding adherence to bylaws while conveniently overlooking her own violations. Just last month, Margaret had sent Diane a violation notice because her garbage can remain at the curb 12 hours after collection, while Diane was in the hospital with pneumonia. The month before that, she'd been fined for garden gnomes that violated the aesthetic harmony of Oak Ridge Estates, despite 3 other homes on the street sporting similar decorations. Diane pulled her robe tighter and marched toward the sliding glass door. As she stepped onto the patio, Margaret spotted her and waved casually as if this were a planned social gathering. "Diane, you're back early. We thought you were returning tomorrow," Margaret called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of entitlement that had become her trademark. She wore an expensive designer swimsuit that strained against her sun-dappled skin, a wide-brimmed hat perched atop her meticulously highlighted blonde hair. "What are you doing in my pool, Margaret?" Diane asked, struggling to keep her voice level. Margaret's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched in surprise. "Oh, didn't you get my message? The community pool is closed for maintenance today, and we had our monthly social scheduled. I left you a voicemail asking if we could use your pool since you were away. When you didn't call back, I assumed it was fine." The other women, Trish Blackwell, Susan Perkins, and Veronica Donahue, exchanged glances, suddenly looking uncomfortable. They comprised the core of Margaret's influence network within the HOA, voting as a block on every proposal Margaret supported. "I never gave permission for this," Diane said firmly. "You're trespassing." Margaret waved a manicured hand dismissively. "Don't be so dramatic, Diane. It's not trespassing when it's for official HOA business. Besides, your pool is barely used, and the landscaping regulations that you voted for actually require recreational features to be maintained for aesthetic purposes. We're helping you stay compliant." Diane felt her jaw clench. This was Margaret's typical strategy, citing obscure bylaw clauses that she'd personally written, twisting them to serve her immediate needs. "You have 15 minutes to gather your things and leave," Diane stated, and turned toward the house as a plan began forming in her mind. "And Margaret, don't mistake my composure for acceptance." Behind her, she heard Margaret's theatrical sigh and muttered comments about some people not understanding community spirit. Diane smiled to herself as she walked back inside. The pool's temperature controls were in the utility room, and she knew exactly what to do next. Inside the utility room, Diane accessed the pool control panel with a vindictive smile. The digital thermostat currently read 82 degrees, perfect for a leisurely weekend float. She tapped the up arrow repeatedly until it displayed 95 degrees, then pressed Apply Settings. The system hummed to life, heating elements engaging beneath the azure water. "Let's see how long your unauthorized pool party lasts now, Margaret," Diane muttered, returning to the kitchen to watch the scene unfold. While waiting, she scrolled through neighborhood social media groups, where Margaret's iron-fisted rule was well documented. Posts about arbitrary fines, denied renovation requests, and passive-aggressive community newsletters filled the feed. Margaret had transformed their once friendly neighborhood into her personal fiefdom, with most residents too intimidated to challenge her. 15 minutes passed, and the women remained in the pool. Diane considered calling the police but hesitated. Escalating too quickly might backfire. As HOA president, Margaret had surprising influence with local authorities. Officer Jenkins, who handled neighborhood disputes, played golf with Margaret's husband every Thursday. Another 10 minutes and Diane noticed Trish Blackwell shifting uncomfortably on her float, dabbing at her increasingly flushed face with a towel. "Is it getting hot in here, or is it just me?" Trish asked, fanning herself with a magazine. Susan dipped her hand in the water and frowned. "The water definitely feels warmer." Margaret dismissed their concerns with a wave. "It's just the sun, ladies. More mimosas." But nature couldn't be denied. The pool, now approaching hot tub temperatures, was becoming unbearable. Veronica was the first to abandon ship, claiming a sudden headache. Susan followed minutes later, mumbling about forgotten appointments. Diane stepped outside again, maintaining her composure. "I believe your 15 minutes are up, Margaret." Margaret glared, mascara slightly smudged from perspiration. "We're having a perfectly civil gathering, Diane. There's no need for hostility." "This isn't hostility, Margaret. It's enforcement of property boundaries, something you should understand quite well." Diane crossed her arms, savoring the moment. Trish climbed out, gathering her belongings. "Margaret, I really should get going. The water's uncomfortably warm." Left alone, Margaret's facade cracked slightly. She paddled to the pool's edge, her skin flushed pink from the heated water. "This isn't over, Diane. The HOA has regulations about pool maintenance and temperature settings." "Fascinating," Diane replied coolly. "I'd love to see where the bylaws authorize you to trespass on private property, or perhaps we should discuss it at the next meeting, with my security footage as a visual aid." Margaret's expression darkened as she hoisted herself out of the pool. Water cascaded from her designer swimsuit as she wrapped herself in a monogrammed towel. "You've always been difficult, Diane. The board tries to build community spirit, and you respond with hostility. This attitude is precisely why we've had to implement stricter rules." "Is that what you call breaking into someone's backyard?" "Community spirit?" Diane crossed the patio table where Margaret's phone and keys sat. "I believe these are yours." Margaret snatched her belongings, dignity in tatters. "This was a simple misunderstanding. I left you a message." "Next time, wait for a response," Diane suggested. "And Margaret, my security system has been upgraded. It now sends real-time alerts to my phone and the police." The threat hung in the air between them. Margaret gathered the last of her things, her movements stiff with suppressed rage. "Enjoy your weekend, Diane," she said with forced pleasantness. "We have an HOA meeting Tuesday. I hope to see you there." The menace in her tone was unmistakable. As Margaret finally exited through the side gate, Diane reset the pool temperature and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. She knew the battle was far from over. Margaret wasn't one to accept defeat gracefully. Something told her that Tuesday's meeting would be unusually eventful, and she needed to prepare. News of the pool incident spread through Oak Ridge Estates like wildfire. By Sunday afternoon, Diane had received 7 text messages from neighbors, each offering their own Margaret horror stories. Apparently, she wasn't the only resident who experienced the HOA president's special brand of entitlement. Carlos Rodriguez from 2 streets over described how Margaret had insisted on inspecting his garage without notice, claiming anonymous complaints about improper storage. Rebecca Chen shared that her approved landscaping had been deemed non-compliant the day after she'd voted against Margaret's proposal to increase HOA dues. Diane saved these messages, forming the outline of a plan. For years, Margaret had maintained control through isolation, making each homeowner feel their grievances were unique. Perhaps it was time for the neighborhood to compare notes. Monday morning, Diane's doorbell rang just as she finished her breakfast. She opened the door to find Donald Peterson, the HOA vice president and Margaret's most reliable ally. A retired accountant with thinning gray hair and perpetually pursed lips, Donald carried a clipboard and wore the grim expression of a man performing an unpleasant duty. "Good morning, Donald," Diane said pleasantly. "What brings you by so early?" He cleared his throat. "Official HOA business, Diane. I've been asked to deliver this." He extended an envelope bearing the Oak Ridge Estates logo. Diane accepted it, already knowing what she'd find inside. "Let me guess. A violation notice?" Donald's eyes darted nervously. "Margaret asked me to inform you that your pool's temperature settings violated Section 7.3 of the Community Guidelines regarding energy efficiency. The fine is $300. Diane laughed, genuinely amused by the audacity. "That's interesting, considering the only way Margaret could know my pool's temperature is if she were trespassing on my property, which I have on video, by the way." Donald shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just delivering the notice, Diane. Disputes can be addressed at tomorrow's meeting." "Oh, I'll be there," Diane assured him. "And Donald, you might want to reconsider your allegiances. Margaret's reign isn't as secure as she believes." After he left, Diane opened her laptop and began organizing the evidence. The security footage showed Margaret and her friends clearly entering without permission. The temperature log from her smart home system documented the pool's normal temperature before she'd adjusted it. She even had screenshots of previous text exchanges where Margaret had properly requested permission to use her pool for other events, proving she understood the protocol she'd violated. By afternoon, Diane had created a private social media group called Oak Ridge Oversight and invited 15 neighbors who'd previously complained about Margaret's tactics. Membership doubled within hours as residents added others who shared their frustrations. "Bring documentation to Tuesday's meeting," Diane posted. "It's time for accountability." That evening, as Diane reviewed her presentation for the HOA meeting, her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. You're making a mistake. Margaret has friends on the city council. Back down now, or you'll regret it. Instead of intimidating her, the anonymous threat reinforced Diane's resolve. She added a screenshot to her growing file of evidence. Tuesday arrived with an unexpected development. As Diane pulled into the community center parking lot for the 7 p.m. meeting, she noticed Margaret engaged in intense conversation with Walter Jenkins, the elderly neighborhood watch coordinator. Walter nodded repeatedly, looking troubled as Margaret pressed something into his hand. Inside, the meeting room was already crowded, unusually so for a routine HOA gathering. Residents who typically avoided these meetings had shown up in force, many offering Diane supportive nods or discreet thumbs-up gestures. Margaret entered precisely at 7 p.m., immaculately dressed in a tailored blazer, her smile tight as she surveyed the packed room. Her gaze lingered on Diane for a moment, eyes narrowing before she took her position at the front table. "Welcome, everyone," Margaret began with practiced authority. "I'm delighted to see such engagement from our community. Before we address the agenda items, Walter has an important security announcement." Walter stood shakily, avoiding eye contact with the residents. There have been reports of unauthorized gatherings and potential conspiracy against the HOA leadership. Such actions violate our community harmony guidelines and could result in significant fines. Diane recognized the desperate move for what it was, Margaret's attempt to intimidate her supporters before they could speak out. Based on the determined expressions around the room, it wasn't working. "Thank you, Walter," Margaret said smoothly, reclaiming control of the meeting. "Now let's move to our first agenda item, property violations." She clicked to a PowerPoint slide showing Diane's house. "We've had concerning reports about private amenities being misused in ways that threaten community standards." Before Margaret could elaborate, Susan Perkins, one of the women from the pool party, raised her hand. "Actually, Margaret, I'd like to speak about that incident." Margaret's smile faltered. "We'll have an open forum after." "I think now is appropriate," Susan interrupted, standing. "I was at Diane Walker's pool on Saturday, and I need to clarify what happened." Margaret's knuckles whitened around her gavel. "Susan, this isn't the proper." "You told us Diane had given permission," Susan continued, addressing the room rather than Margaret. "You showed us a text that you claimed was from her. I have screenshots of our group chat where you stated, and I quote, Diane's thrilled to let us use her pool while she's away." A murmur swept through the room. Margaret's face flushed crimson. "There seems to be some confusion," Margaret attempted, her voice strained. "As HOA president, I have certain inspection rights." "That's not accurate," came a new voice. Jerome Williams, a retired lawyer who rarely attended meetings, stood from his seat in the back row. "I've reviewed our bylaws thoroughly. There is no provision granting the HOA president or any board member the right to enter private property without explicit permission or proper notice for specific inspection purposes." Margaret's eyes darted around the room, noting the shifting atmosphere. "We can discuss bylaw interpretations later. Let's return to our agenda." "I move to amend the agenda," Diane said, rising from her seat. "I'd like to address the board's overreach and propose new guidelines for HOA governance." "I second the motion," called Rebecca Chen. "Thirded," added Carlos Rodriguez. Margaret rapped her gavel sharply. "This is highly irregular. We have procedures, which you routinely ignore," Diane replied calmly, approaching the front of the room with her laptop. "May I connect this to the projector?" Donald Peterson, watching the room's mood, nodded despite Margaret's glare. "I think we should hear what Diane has to say." As Diane connected her computer, Margaret leaned close and whispered, "You have no idea what you're starting. I've run this community for 8 years. Nobody cares about your petty grievances." Diane smiled politely. "Then you have nothing to worry about." Her presentation began with a timeline of documented HOA violations against various homeowners, paired with contradicting examples where Margaret had committed similar violations without consequences. Next came the security footage showing Margaret entering Diane's backyard, followed by text messages where Margaret had previously acknowledged the need for permission. "This isn't about a single incident," Diane explained to the riveted audience. "It's about consistent abuse of authority. Our HOA exists to maintain property values and community standards, not to serve as anyone's personal power trip." She proposed a series of reforms, transparent documentation of all violation notices, a review committee for contested fines, term limits for board positions, and a requirement that all property inspections be scheduled in advance with homeowner consent. As Diane concluded, applause erupted from the residents. Even board members like Donald seemed thoughtful, nodding at several of the proposals. Margaret stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. These allegations are taken out of context. I've dedicated years to maintaining our community standards." "Perhaps too many years," Jerome suggested quietly. "I move that we vote on Diane's proposals. And I move that we first vote on whether the current board should continue in their positions, added Rebecca Chen, her voice steady despite Margaret's withering glare. Margaret's carefully constructed facade cracked completely. You can't do this. This meeting isn't authorized to hold leadership votes without proper notice. Actually, Jerome corrected, Article 4, Section 3 of our bylaws states that leadership votes can be held at any regular meeting if 2/3 of attending members support the motion. Hands raised throughout the room. The revolution Margaret had feared was happening right before her eyes. The emergency board election results were devastating for Margaret. By a margin of 47-3, the residents voted to remove her as HOA president. Donald Peterson surprisingly abstained, murmuring something about seeing which way the wind blows. Only Trish Blackwell and Veronica Donahue, Margaret's remaining pool party guests, voted in her favor. This is temporary insanity, Margaret declared as Jerome tallied the votes. You'll all regret this when your property values plummet. I protected this neighborhood from decline for nearly a decade. No one responded to her outburst. Instead, nominations began for interim board positions until a formal election could be scheduled. Diane was unanimously nominated for interim president, a position she accepted with reluctance and a promise to serve only until proper elections could be held. As the meeting adjourned, residents lingered, sharing stories of Margaret's reign that they'd previously kept to themselves. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if a collective burden had been lifted from the neighborhood. Margaret stood isolated near the refreshment table, mechanically stirring a cup of untouched coffee. When Diane approached her, she straightened her shoulders defensively. "Congratulations on your coup," Margaret said icily. "Enjoy your moment while it lasts." "This wasn't about you or me," Diane replied. "It was about restoring fairness to how our community operates." Margaret's laugh was brittle. "You have no idea what you've taken on. The complaints, the demands, the endless emails from entitled homeowners who think rules shouldn't apply to them. They'll turn on you just as quickly." For a moment, Diane glimpsed something almost human in Margaret's expression, exhaustion perhaps, or disillusionment. She wondered if Margaret had started with good intentions before power warped her perspective. "Maybe," Diane conceded, "but I plan to listen more than I dictate. There's a difference." Margaret gathered her belongings, dignity somehow intact despite the evening's humiliation. "We'll see how long that idealism lasts. This neighborhood chews up do-gooders and spits them out." She paused at the door, turning back to Diane with a strange half-smile. "By the way, your pool really is lovely. Perhaps next time I'll actually wait for permission." With that parting shot, she was gone, leaving Diane to wonder if she'd just witnessed a concession or a threat. The following days brought an avalanche of emails from residents eager to share ideas and grievances with the new interim board. Diane quickly understood what Margaret had meant about the demands of leadership. For every reasonable suggestion, there were 3 impractical complaints or requests for special exemptions. She established office hours at the community center twice weekly and created a transparent system for tracking violation notices and appeals. The work was time-consuming but oddly satisfying. Small changes, like explaining citations rather than simply issuing fines, seemed to reduce neighborhood tensions dramatically. A week after the contentious meeting, Diane was reviewing financial records when she discovered irregularities in the HOA accounts. Certain maintenance expenses seemed inflated, with payments going to companies that left no digital footprint. When she called the landscaping service listed on several large invoices, they claimed they'd never worked in Oak Ridge estates. Further investigation revealed a pattern. Substantial HOA funds had been diverted to shell companies over the past 3 years. The paper trail led to a surprising name, not Margaret Hollingsworth, but Donald Peterson, a seemingly innocuous vice president who had so carefully positioned himself as a moderate during the leadership transition. That evening, as Diane compiled evidence for the board, her doorbell rang. She opened it to find Margaret standing on her porch, expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "May I come in?" Margaret asked, her usual imperious tone notably absent. "There's something you need to know about Donald and the HOA finances." Diane hesitated before stepping aside to let Margaret enter. The woman who strode into her living room seemed diminished somehow, still impeccably dressed and perfectly coiffed, but lacking the aggressive energy that had defined her presence for years. "Coffee," Diane offered, more from habit than hospitality. "Please," Margaret replied, settling onto the edge of the sofa. She placed a flash drive on the coffee table between them. "You found the discrepancies in the maintenance accounts, I assume." Diane's surprise must have shown on her face because Margaret nodded knowingly. "Of course you did. You're thorough. It's why I always found you so irritating," Margaret said with a hint of her old sharpness. "What you don't know is that I've been tracking those irregularities for months. Donald's been skimming from the HOA funds since before I became president." "And you never reported it?" Diane asked, returning with 2 mugs. Margaret grimaced. "It's complicated. When I discovered the first discrepancies 3 years ago, Donald threatened to reveal certain improprieties in how I'd been elected. There was a ballot situation. Nothing criminal, but embarrassing enough that I couldn't risk exposure. So you became his puppet, Diane concluded. I prefer to think of it as a compromise, Margaret corrected stiffly. I maintained my position and implemented the community standards I believed in. In exchange, I'd overlooked his financial manipulations. That's still embezzlement, Diane pointed out. Both of you could face charges. Margaret sipped her coffee, perfectly steady despite the implication. That flash drive contains everything you need to prove Donald's guilt. Bank transfers, shell company registrations, even recordings of conversations where he explicitly discussed the scheme. You'll notice I'm never implicated directly. Why give this to me now? Because he's planning something bigger, Margaret said, leaning forward intently. The Westview Development Project. Donald's brother-in-law sits on the planning commission. They're pushing for rezoning that would allow commercial property at the edge of our neighborhood. Donald's been buying up adjacent lots through those same shell companies. Diane processed this information, seeing the larger picture emerge. The property values would drop for residential homes near commercial zones. Precisely. Meanwhile, the HOA has earmarked funds for community enhancement that will somehow never materialize. Donald gets rich, the neighborhood suffers, and he's positioned you as the face of these decisions. The irony wasn't lost on Diane. After all of her complaints about Margaret's iron-fisted rule, she now faced a threat that made Margaret seem benign by comparison. Why should I believe you? Diane asked directly. This could be your revenge plot. Get me to make accusations against Donald based on fabricated evidence, destroy my credibility, then sweep back into power. Margaret's laugh held genuine amusement. That's diabolical even for me. No, I'm done with HOA politics. I'm selling my house next month, moving to Arizona to be near my daughter. But I spent 8 years building this community, and I'll be damned if I watch Donald Peterson dismantle it for profit. The doorbell interrupted them. Through the window, Diane saw Donald standing on her porch, his normally placid expression replaced by agitation. That's my cue to leave, Margaret said, standing quickly. He saw my car and is undoubtedly wondering what we're discussing. There's a neighborhood council meeting tomorrow about the rezoning proposal. The evidence on that drive should be enough to halt the process while investigations occur. Use my back door, Diane suggested, surprising herself with the conspiratorial offer. As Margaret slipped out through the kitchen, Diane took a deep breath and went to answer the front door, the flash drive heavy in her pocket. Donald's nervous smile did nothing to mask the calculation in his eyes. Diane started to drop by unannounced. Is someone here? I thought I saw Margaret's car. Donald, Diane greeted him with forced casualness. What brings you by so late? She stepped onto the porch, pulling the door nearly closed behind her to prevent him from seeing inside. The flash drive felt conspicuous in her pocket, though she knew it was invisible. I was driving past and noticed Margaret's car, he said, peering over Diane's shoulder. I found it, concerning recent events. Margaret dropped off some HOA documentation I requested, Diane improvised. Past violation records, budget reports, for continuity purposes. Donald's false smile tightened. How considerate of her. Though she should have coordinated with me as treasurer. Those documents are confidential. I am the interim president, Diane reminded him mildly. Of course, he conceded. Speaking of which, I wanted to discuss tomorrow's rezoning meeting. The developer has made some compelling arguments for how their project could benefit our community. Increased tax base, amenities, potentially even HOA fee reductions. Sounds too good to be true, Diane observed. Not at all. I've reviewed their proposal thoroughly. In fact, I prepared some remarks for you to deliver at the meeting, expressing the HOA's provisional support pending community input. He extended a folder which Diane reluctantly accepted. I haven't formed an opinion yet, Donald. I'll need to review all the materials first. His expression hardened momentarily before smoothing back into affability. Certainly. Just remember that development is inevitable. We can either shape it or be shaped by it. After Donald left, Diane locked her doors and plugged in Margaret's flash drive. The contents were meticulously organized, spreadsheets tracking diverted funds, corporate registration documents for shell companies, and most damning audio recordings of Donald discussing the scheme with his brother-in-law. Once rezoning passes, we'll control both sides of the equation, Donald's voice explained in one recording. The commercial parcels appreciate while the adjacent residential properties depreciate. We buy those at reduced values, consolidate, and flip to the developer for Phase 2. Diane worked late into the night preparing a presentation that incorporated this evidence. By morning, she had contacted Jerome Williams for legal advice and arranged for 3 other board members to review the materials before the rezoning meeting. The community center was packed by 7 p.m. Residents filled every chair, with latecomers standing along the walls. At the front table sat members of the Planning Commission and the developers' representatives, and surprisingly, Officer Jenkins from the police department. Donald arrived looking confident, nodding to several commission members as if they shared an understanding. His composure faltered when he saw Jerome Williams sitting beside Diane, legal pad in hand. When the meeting began, the developer presented first, describing a neighborhood-friendly commercial complex with upscale shops, restaurants, and office space. Their architectural renderings showed tasteful buildings with abundant green space, conveniently omitting the loading docks, dumpsters, and parking lots that would border residential properties. This project will enhance your community, the developer concluded smoothly. Property values throughout Oak Ridge Estates should benefit from proximity to such amenities. Donald stood to speak next, his prepared statement echoing these rosy projections. He was halfway through when Diane noticed Margaret slip into the back of the room, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. When Donald finished, the commission chairman turned to Diane. As HOA president, do you have any comments before we open to general questions? Diane approached the podium, heart racing. Yes, I do. But they're not about the merits of this development. They concern the integrity of this entire process. She connected her laptop to the projector. The first slide showed a web of shell companies all linked to Donald Peterson and his brother-in-law on the Planning Commission. Before anyone votes on this proposal, Diane stated clearly, you should know that certain parties have manipulated this process for personal gain at the expense of our community. Donald half rose from his seat, face ashen. This is slander. I move that we. Sit down, Mr. Peterson. Officer Jenkins interrupted, stepping forward. I think we all need to hear this.